Today we have Marie Sanchez joining us from the other Cambridge all the way over in Massachusetts. Marie is a doctoral student in sociology at Harvard. Her research interests lie at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and cultural sociology, focusing on questions of ethnoracial boundaries, classification, and knowledge production. Her research is funded by the Russell Sage Foundation and the Harvard Krupp Center for European Studies. Before grad school, Marie worked more than 10 years in the advertising world, where she specialized in analyzing, understanding, and creating cultural narratives of diversity and inclusion. Before Marie presents her paper for all of us, I just need to let you know that this is being filmed. If anyone doesn't want to be caught on camera, I think you can just kind of make eye contact with me now and let me know. Actually, there's too much eye contact, but you were smiling. So Marie's going to be giving her paper, Non-White Metacategories in the United States and the United Kingdom. I believe it's a work in progress from your PhD dissertation. I've managed to see a sneak preview of it in your dissertation committee, and I think it's absolutely amazing work. I'm looking forward to seeing you present on it now. So I'm going to move out of your way, and then I'll move the chair back when we start talking.
Can you all hear me okay? I need to go this way more? Okay. All right, so I don't need to yell or anything. This is good volume. All right, so as Ali mentioned, this is very much work in progress. Literally a week and a half ago, I had a meeting with my committee to share rough field notes. And in the last 10 days, I started working on a framing that is very rough, so I'm hoping to share that with you. It will be, as I mentioned, quite rough, full of holes, but hopefully we can kind of work it out together and make this a little bit of a learning session from each other, because I am not from the UK, as you can probably tell, and I would love to make sure that I really understand what I'm getting myself into. So I want to start with my broader research agenda, because I'm only going to show you a small piece of it today based on what I've been able to theorize in the last week and a half. And that's this idea of these non-white metacategories. So over 100 years ago, American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois famously identified a color line dividing whites and non-whites across the world. And in several Western societies, this divide has been reified by different categories that lump together non-white populations despite their demographic, cultural, and political heterogeneity. So my research is really about these non-white metacategories. It's a term that I've coined to describe umbrella categories that encapsulate multiple subgroups that would be racialized or considered non-white. And it's kind of interesting to me because these non-white metacategories, as you can see from this schematic, are really several steps removed from an individual's national origins or even pan-ethnic subcategories. And as a result, they really do aggregate very heterogeneous populations with distinct histories, oppressions, and needs. So for example, in the US, we might have Mexican. I'm the child of Mexican immigrants. That might be sort of the one example of a fine-grained micro-category. We could even probably get even more fine-grained than that. My parents are from Mexico City, so we're the Feños. We could go to an ethnoracial subcategory or pan-ethnic category one step above, like Hispanic, Latino, Latinx. And then this non-white meta-category in the US might be people of color, women of color, minority woman. And you can imagine how something similar might happen in the UK with somebody of Pakistani descent, who then could be one level up Asian, British Asian, and then one level up BAME. So what's interesting to me is that a lot of research tends to focus on these two categories, and there's not a lot of attention paid to the racial formation of non-white metacategories, particularly in a sustained or comprehensive comparison across national contexts. And I'm going to argue that that's a major oversight, as non-white metacategories can focus attention on particular types of racisms. So for example, Eduardo Bonilla Silva isn't here, but he's argued about a triracial hierarchy. Non-white metacategories, by definition, focus us on a particular type of schism, which is white versus non-white. They also illuminate certain inequalities while obscuring others. So, for example, our very own Ali Meghji has argued that we should really be paying attention to activists as kind of a reciprocal form of learning about their visions of society and their theories of power. And many activists have critiqued these non-white metacategories because they bring attention to white supremacy, but not enough attention to anti-blackness. And as a result of these different things, you can imagine the non-white meta-categories really inform available courses of action and conversations and discourses about how to achieve racial justice. The other thing that I think is important to note about non-white meta-categories is that if we look carefully, they exist in a lot of different contexts. So for example, I'm going to talk today a lot about the British category BAME. But in Canada, do we have any folks from Canada here at all? No? Or familiar with the Canadian context? There are non-white meta-categories called visible minorities, and actually they've had to undergo an extensive consultative effort to kind of revise this category because it's come under a lot of scrutiny. If anyone's familiar with the Dutch context, there's a non-white meta-category called non-Western allochthone in the 20th century, which was recently replaced with people with a migration background to seem less stigmatizing. But it ultimately does the same thing that a lot of non-white meta-categories do, which is distinguish between European whiteness and non-European non-whiteness. So as you can probably imagine by what I've just mentioned, there's really a sort of a rich and important history that we need to understand that's informing these categories. A lot of post-colonial scholars have pointed out that contemporary racial hierarchies are really based on these colonial relations of power and draw upon a foundational binary between European white and non-European that was construed in tandem with Western colonialism. So even though racial taxonomies can kind of change and census categories can change, a lot of times this colonial binary, aptly referred to as the West versus the rest by Stuart Hall, continues to shape those racial classifications and has a lot of durability. On the other hand, even though these categories can be oppressive, homogenizing, a way to say this is white as an unmarked category and you lot are in this other category, it can also be repurposed as a basis for interracial coalition building and mobilization. And there's actually a very long, rich history constructing a unified identity and solidarity among the axis of being colored, third world, or other, which really makes non-white meta-categories sort of a rich territory for conversations about racial difference and justice. They're frequently sort of in the repertoire when it comes to discussing racial equity. One final note that I want to talk about in sort of theorizing why non-white meta-categories are particularly interesting for us and why they're not like other ethnic and racial subcategories is because they're often not official, legal, or statistical census categories. That doesn't mean that they're not state categories. They are intricately tied to the state because of its history of nation building and the development of national narratives of belonging or non-belonging if you don't happen to be white and European. And that's why they often appear explicitly or implicitly in data collection, reports, and legislation produced by the state. For example, some of you might be familiar with this very famous prediction, the minority-majority prediction released by the US Census in 2008, caused a lot of stir. And at the foundation of that was this non-white meta-category minority. You guys might also be familiar with some of these examples, like all the reports that were coming from the NHS during COVID about how BAME populations were more affected. You can also imagine that there's lots of other kind of reports that are using BAME as a category, like for example, creative industries in the United Kingdom. So these categories then become so ingrained not only in the state kind of infrastructure, but also in our daily life in terms of like organization names, like BAME Ed here, employee networks, like the WHT BAME Staff Support Group, news reports and headlines, like some of the ones I've mentioned, to the point that they really start to slip below the threshold of visibility and become taken for granted. So in terms of my case, I realized because these non-white meta-categories exist in a lot of different Western, hi. It's like the Kool-Aid man just breaking through the wall. So because of the presence of these non-white meta-categories in a lot of different Western countries, I think it's important to really think about this from a comparative relational perspective. So I focus on the United States and the United Kingdom, two Western countries with histories of both empire and anti-racist mobilizations, which are currently grappling with unprecedented levels of ethnoracial diversity from the global South. In the US, just to put a finer point on it, hopefully you've been tracking as I've been talking about non-white meta-categories in the aggregate, but in the United States, they'll specifically include minority and variations of people of color. Could be woman of color, person of color, community of color, the more recent BIPOC. Raise your hand if you've heard of BIPOC. Quite a few of you, okay. And then in the UK, the category politically black, very uniquely British. Nothing quite like that exists in the US. And then variations on minority ethnic, like BME, black minority ethnic, black and minority ethnic, or BAME, black Asian minority ethnic. Have you guys heard of BAME? Yes, probably everybody, right? Okay. So because of this kind of like historical legacy with these categories, I think it's helpful to start with a little bit of context before I dive a little bit more deeply into the findings. So non-white meta-categories in both countries have experienced really surprisingly similar trajectories. And what's particularly useful is that around 2020, they both became unsettled in both countries. So as I'll explain in a little bit, that kind of makes them a very interesting and approachable site for investigation. When things are unsettled, they sort of bring some taken for granted assumptions into sharp relief. So I'm using a relational comparative lens here, which is going to allow me to examine how these trajectories could be connected through legacies of colonial domination, racialization, as well as cross-racial resistance and solidarity. But also, I want to understand how local structures and conditions can lead to these transnational norms about racial difference and racial justice kind of manifesting differently in each national context. So as I mentioned at the start, the genesis of these categories really starts with colonial origins and the different ways and essentialist beliefs that colonial empires kind of created this color-coded social hierarchy in the wake of the colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. But fast forwarding a little bit more recently, in both countries, activists and governments have leveraged these categories for over 50 years. So again, there's quite a lot of continuity with these categories, even though we might not realize how kind of omnipresent they are in our histories and in our lives. So anti-racist and anti-colonial movements in the 60s and the 70s employed the categories people of color, communities of color, women of color in the US, and politically black in the UK to encourage cross-racial solidarity in the pursuit of rights and empowerment. Government bodies used designations like minority in the US and minority ethnic in the UK since around the 60s and the 70s to improve administrative efficiency when identifying groups for legal protections. Then if you fast forward even a little bit more, criticism against the categories in both countries escalated around the 2020 global diffusion of the Black Lives Matter movement. Non-white communities, online and in person, were starting to debate and kind of with much more salience who belongs to the categories, how the categories erase or highlight specific groups, and whether the categories should be emphasizing white supremacy or if maybe, as I mentioned in the beginning, anti-blackness is a more important sort of form of racism or racial schism to really emphasize. So in 2020, various institutions and then later some government offices in 2022 officially abandoned the categories. They adopted more fine-grained alternatives. In the US, that's when BIPOC really took off, even though it had been kind of floating around in the ecosphere for a while. It wasn't really until 2022 that it appeared suddenly everywhere as a way to center Black and Indigenous experiences. Specifically in the US, if we look again at the state, updates announced in 2022 to the Office of Management Budget Statistical Directive 15, which provides standards for federal statistics and administrative reporting of racial and ethnic data, had something to say about non-white meta-categories. They basically said, don't use minority, don't use majority, and on top of that, we're also gonna disaggregate for the first time all the ethnic and racial subcategories that we have. So for the first time, the category Black was disaggregated, the category white was disaggregated, in addition to Asian, Hispanic, Latino, and the addition of Middle Eastern. So clearly, even as they're rejecting sort of or eliminating non-white meta-categories, they're also simultaneously adopting an approach that embraces greater specificity and disaggregation. In the UK, y'all might be familiar with the Cabinet Office of Race Disparity Unit. In 2022, they announced their standards for government departments on how to communicate ethnicity data, and they included the recommendation to also create more specificity and to also eliminate the non-white meta-category BAME. So as we can see earlier, this tension that I spoke about is really present in this history. These categories are, again, a source of state control, but also a source of solidarity and mobilization, a way to distribute rights, but more recently also a source of concern about whether categories are actually obscuring specific needs and maybe exacerbating inequalities in the distribution of rights. And as you'll see, I'm going to sustain attention to both state and minority civic leaders in my analysis. So let's dive, now that I've given all this context, quite a lot of context, I want to dive a little bit more specifically into the research question that I'm going to talk about today, which, as I mentioned, is going to zoom in on a particular moment of this history, which is this moment of debate that we just experienced 2 to 4 years ago, in which these categories became unsettled, challenged, and revised in the US and the UK. So I'm only focusing on that sub-question. There's other pieces of the data and sort of the larger research agenda that I'm happy to talk about afterwards, but this is kind of the small sliver that I'm cutting off for today. And I think in particular, I'm really interested for this talk in the structure of claims making that made possible the institutional abandonment of non-white metacategories in the US and the UK, and understanding how those changes were both kind of maybe connected by a similar transnational kind of shift, but also kind of understanding the differences in each local context. And I think, just to reiterate based on this history that I shared, while like any category, non-white metacategories are never completely settled, they have been around for a long time, as I've demonstrated. So what does it mean that they're suddenly scratched in the civil and state spheres? What happens now? So this part of the project is going to examine sites of debate for analytic leverage. Sites of debate are really good places to understand cultural and institutional change. Scholars of controversial studies and cultural sociology argue that sites of debate really help make explicit sociocultural ideologies at play in the stabilization of new cultural objects. It's also a place where actors are actively engaging in claims making about the categories. So again, I can start to see some of those things that maybe would have been taken for granted not so long ago start to become a little bit more explicit. So especially because it's a place where a lot of actors are engaging in claims making, I'm really targeting and interviewing those thought leaders in the US and the UK. I'm defining them as people who have spoken up publicly about the categories, maybe provided some kind of justification, whether through data or anecdotes, and have some sort of audience or platform to share these perspectives. And I think this makes a lot of sense for this particular case. Literature on racial and ethnic categories, drawing on Pierre Bourdieu, points to the importance of ethnic entrepreneurs, not entrepreneurs in the sense of like starting businesses, but entrepreneurs who really transform how we perceive social reality, how we perceive differences in others, who are responsible basically for trying to highlight certain dimensions of difference over others and ultimately impose their vision on the social world. They're also the most invested in these categories, which are viewed increasingly as the concern of educated elites rather than the everyday racialized people they are meant to describe. So I located these thought leaders primarily through their public commentary around the categories, which they shared through major news, magazines, publications, blogs, and podcasts, or in social media platforms. Even those who maybe didn't provide op-eds about the categories maybe would have been recruited by news outlets to share their perspectives in interviews because they were identified as having an important opinion in the space. A few others were recruited via snowballing through my respondents. And then I also recruited informants from each country, including reporters and academics who had written on the categories or related topics to kind of point me in the right direction of the timeline of the debates, the topics of debates, as well as the various actors and institutions involved. So as you can see, I really kind of tried to get at this from a lot of different angles because it's difficult to really understand like the contours of a debate, right? So I had to be kind of scrappy in my approach. So this led to a really interesting sample. I have 42 respondents in the US. Actually, sorry, that's 43. Didn't update my notes. 43 in the US and 45 in the UK. And this includes public intellectuals, culture workers, DEI experts, nonprofit and corporate leaders, consultants, activists, think tanks, social media influencers, podcasters, especially as conversations about race increasingly take place online, at least in the US instead of in schools. There's also some government folks still working through some of that, but there's also a lot of content analysis available, which I've also started, and this kind of mimics other approaches that look at the state's role in ethnic and racial categories. So you probably will have noticed that there's a lot of different fields here, right? There's culture workers, writers, talk to a comedian, influencers. There's organizations from higher ed to corporate DEI to nonprofits to the media. Maybe some of you are familiar with the 5 UK broadcasters that pledged to never use BAME again. Yes? No? That's okay. As well as the state, right? But there's actually a lot of overlap. So I don't necessarily think it's useful to distinguish the different sort of professions here, because organizational actors can also be sort of influencers in the social media space. Culture workers can be hired by organizations based on their opinions, and states are always actively recruiting and consulting with organizations and culture workers to make their work legible. I should also mention that there are different sides to the debate. So some people are kind of disengaged. What does this really matter? They're not in the majority, though, let me tell you. The vast majority have actually a very sort of emotional investment in the debates, because they tie them kind of inextricably to race relations. So among that group, there's folks who want to keep the categories because they believe that they're important. People who want to modify them, so maybe adding, for example, an R to BAME, so it becomes BAMER. People who want to replace them, maybe some of you have heard global majority. And some of them who just want to eliminate them altogether. There's also very different ideological spectrums at play in my sample. So for example, are you guys familiar with Lord Tony Sewell and the infamous Sewell Report? Yeah, interviewed him. He went on record, so it's okay, I can mention him. And you might remember that in addition to claiming that racism didn't exist in the UK, he also proposed getting rid of BAME as one of his key kind of practical accomplishments in addressing race disparities in the UK. We don't need BAME anymore, he said. So I'm talking to him, and the next day I'm talking to Rosemary Campbell-Stevens. Have you guys heard of the term global majority? I'm sure it's like sort of making its way around. She's the person who really popularized it, and she's kind of going on an international circuit to talk about what it means to have a global majority mindset and how this can really help people from minoritized backgrounds feel empowered whenever they walk into a room and kind of situate social problems in a transnational space. So you can imagine how different it is to have these two people side by side in conversations, but also unexpectedly aligning that we need to get rid of BAME. So there's an important sort of ideological spectrum here at place, and for some reason a lot of these people are sort of aligning that these things need to be changed. So as you can see, my sample is complex, reflects the messiness of the public sphere and the ways that different strategies and motivations may align to produce a certain outcome. Just making sure I'm not going over too late. So I interviewed them to understand how they interpret, debate, and transform meanings around the categories, as well as how they imagine society's racial divides, opportunities for cross-racial solidarity, pathways for justice, and of course, how they were sort of strategically positioning themselves in the field of debate. As I mentioned, overwhelmingly, my respondents chose to remain on the record, and I think, as we'll see a little bit later, that's probably important and related to why they got involved in these debates in the first place. Okay, so now that I've given you so much context, I want to try out some thinking, as I mentioned, a small sliver of my research. So again, this is really, kind of raw. This is a little bit underdeveloped. I'm aware that I would probably need to develop this a lot more, but I really like to test it out with you to see if I'm moving in the right direction, if this feels compelling, or if maybe altogether I need to shift gears. So one of the things that's been really bothering me as I dug into the literature is that there's this nagging truism that comes up time and time again. The state makes racial and ethnic categories. And you can see this thinking in this quote from a scholar that I actually admire quite a bit, Deborah Thompson, who wrote The Schematic State, which compares British, American, and Canadian racial and ethnic census categories. She basically says this investigation about about the meaning of racial and racial inequality requires a close examination of racial classifications, which leads her directly to the doorstep of the state, which has been largely responsible for the definition and manipulation of racial classification schema. So I should be kind to Deborah because she's certainly not alone. And following Following a neo-Weberian turn, scholarship on racial and ethnic categories has typically focused on the role of the state in making race and ethnicity. Scholars who are interested in the intersection of rationalized bureaucracy and the logics of classification have looked primarily to the state and its official classifications, which it makes sense. They're public in nature, they carry implications for government policy and collective action. Likewise, the study of statistics and knowledge collection, there's always sort of a state-centered bias here by suggesting that states are the primary social constructor of censuses and by extension, race and ethnicity. I see at least 3 problems with this approach that have been bugging me and that I want to do something about. First is the focus on the role of the state as a leading actor in creating categories. In a very provocative critique, historical sociologist Rebecca Meghji argues that the state-centered approach ignores the power and the influence of the social, of the non-state actors who can also influence ethnic and racial categories at a large scale. She argues that there are actually 2 models to consider in the construction of categories. State-centered models, the ones that we're familiar with, in which government officials develop census categories, individuals adopt those categories, and then they become widespread. But maybe there's also a society-centered model in which states respond to already widespread social categories and then collect information in response to that. So to demonstrate that point, she and her co-authors examine the creation of the first American census and demonstrate that politicians, instead of inventing categories out of nowhere, actually drew on already existing, widely acknowledged racialized legal categories like white male when creating census categories. So a handful of studies have tried to really explore in more detail how state and social influences interact, but these society-centered models still remain very underspecified. So for example, Michael Rodriguez-Muñiz, another intellectual hero of mine, argues that the state is constantly trying to overcome illegibility, this kind of lack of knowledge about its subjects and their identities so that it can administer and control. So it consequently relies on community leaders to legitimate categories and convince hard-to-reach populations to cooperate with legibility projects like fulfilling the census. This is definitely very important, great work. But it still assumes sort of a processual model in which action originates with the state, who then recruits non-state leaders to implement or transform categories. It doesn't explore the possibility of a different processual flow altogether, in which maybe there are debates in the public sphere about racial and ethnic categories, and then those filter back to the state afterwards. The second problem is that this approach, the state-centered approach, takes for granted that state categories are equivalent to census categories. So it overlooks the role of non-census but equally consequential categories that are used by the state and can diffuse into the public sphere. So there's a lot of work, Ellis Monk, on non-state categories and what we miss by looking only at state categories. And in addition, in her famous book, National Colors, Mara Loveman basically compares 19 different Latin American countries to show that legal institutionalization of ethnoracial categories isn't actually a necessary condition for the political construction of racial or ethnic boundaries. So she's really, even though she's a very big sort of analytic focus on the state in her research, she's actually cautioning us against overstating the power of states to naturalize ethnic and racial categories and divides. And we learned earlier from Rebecca Meghji, that state actors can draw on widespread social or folk categories when implementing census categories. So I think this is, again, another really interesting opportunity for non-white meta-categories because they're not often official legal categories. They're really a prime opportunity to examine what happens when these categories shift shapes in the public sphere, and what happens then when those public debates influence the categories used by the state and other institutions. Finally, and most importantly, the state-centric approach positions the state as the main or the sole site of claims making. Claims being demands, criticisms, or declarative statements that actors make in relation to the public, in relation to public debate. So similar to scholarship on race and ethnicity, scholarship on claims making and social movements has really shifted away from state-centered explanations in the last 10 years towards an examination of how fields are actually made up of a plethora of different actors who shape the context of claim making. So they imagine sort of multiple sources of power that are both material and symbolic, and it means that state actors aren't the only creators of opportunity structures, but they're really just one of many, albeit very powerful actors in a complex field of politics. So again, without downplaying the significance of the state, we must recognize that claims making can target or impact multiple institutions, practices, and systems of knowledge and cultural norms. So coming back to my question, so again, while these non-white meta-categories in the US and UK had never been fully settled, there were always sort of little moments around them. They had been around for a long time, and then they were eliminated. After 50 years, we saw meaningful material changes around the categories in the public sphere when multiple organizations aligned to abandon them in 2020, and the state followed suit later in 2022. So to answer that question about why is this happening, I was thinking a lot this last week, these last 10 days, about the structural conditions that made this moment in the politics of representation kind of unique. And I was kind of maybe pointing to or leaning toward this idea of an emerging economy of representation. And what I mean by that is that there's this whole ecosystem of people who are in the business of making identity claims legible and incorporating ethnic and racial politics into institutions that are not the state. Right? It's not limited to a particular profession. It spans a variety of positions and professional spheres. So there's corporate DEI professionals, nonprofit consultants and advocates, higher education programs, academics producing knowledge about racialized communities. We are very much in the business of what's the right terminology to use. So we have this classic site of the state as a site of symbolic politics. And as I explained in the historical background, yes, non-white meta-category shifts eventually did make it to the state. We also have this other sphere where it's partly economic, civil, social, that has this whole kind of expertise that emerged around it. And these actors were all stepping up very quickly to put a stake in the ground about where they stood on the topic of non-white meta-category debates. And I couldn't help but notice that there was sort of a field consolidating around this attentive, accurate representation of diverse communities as a form of symbolic capital. How do you know when a field has formed? Is when a form of capital has consecrated, right? So for many of these actors, being attentive to debates and concerns, adopting the latest terminology to describe racial and ethnic communities, showing that they really have that ear to the ground, is not only demonstrating that they're with the times, but actually provides them an important competitive advantage. And we can definitely ask, especially as I'm going to share some of my findings in a little bit, how much of that may actually be performative? Is it really for the benefit of the racial and ethnic communities that they're trying to service? But at the very least, I think one thing is very clear, well, hopefully will be clear through my findings, demonstrating that you're in the know about these debates and that you're sort of taking a very expert position in the debates creates a lot of legitimacy for these actors and organizations. Although I'm not kind of completely resurrecting a Bourdieusian field approach, I do think it's helpful to kind of situate these developments in a field populated by actors, networks, and organizations competing over material resources and symbolic representations. Bourdieu thought about the politics of representations in terms of these fields. They were made up of a set of forces and defined by the struggles aimed at transforming the relationship among those forces. So you can think of it as a space of possibilities or options given to participants in the field at any given moment. And corresponding to the distribution of capital is a space of struggle between different postures or position taking. And it isn't just about material resources like state power, but also how the game is organized, who has symbolic power to actually define the categories of representation, the categories that we use to structure social reality. Importantly, fields are always populated by actors coming from elsewhere that need to adapt to the new idiom of the field. So it's not necessarily a problem that I have all of these kind of diverse professional spheres represented. Hopefully this isn't redundant, but just to kind of create a little bit more tangibility around this, I really like George Steinmetz's use of the Bourdieusian field approach and power when he's theorizing the colonial state as a semi-autonomous field with a specific form of symbolic capital. He's really arguing that different German social groups, including the nobility, the bourgeoisie, and an educated middle class, are competing in the colonial state for ethnographic capital. This is a type of symbolic capital involved in exhibiting talent for judging the character of the colonized natives and knowing how to manage them. So competition among these different groups vying for ethnographic capital is what he argued was sort of a main mechanism shaping the production of native policy. So he's using the case of ethnographic capital in colonial states. I'm not sure what I would call this here. Is it racial identification capital? Is it something else? Maybe there's a clever name you can help me figure out. But it's really that ability to demonstrate some sort of expertise or knowledge about salient racial identities and terminology and how to best organize rapidly increasing demographic diversity. So as different actors prove that they can, or demonstrate that they have an ear to what these diverse communities are talking about and how these communities want to be represented, they're reflecting those changes in organizational processes and policies. Finally, I think that sort of, if we think about it in those terms, it gives us a new model of society-centered processes. So instead of, again, focusing our locus of attention on the state, the economy of representation as this private and civil sector is where a lot of action is happening, and then it turns out to influence the state. It offers us sort of the opportunity to compare this kind of very quick-moving economy of representation to the longer role of the state, because there's really quick pivots that they can make to the debates, which can then, based on that speed of response, influence the longer arc of the bureaucratic state. So remembering that the state is constantly trying to maintain legitimacy and legibility, as James Scott argues, that is to organize the governed for administration and rule, and fitting society into categories that enable its administrative intervention. That's really a key part of this endeavor, right? Finding the right categories that the governed will kind of respond with and allow them to be neatly categorized and organized. But the state can't always keep up with the rapid changes in racial and ethnic categories happening in the public sphere. So while one strategy, as I mentioned with Michael Rodriguez Muniz's work, might be to recruit community leaders to build consensus, another might be to wait for the dust to settle in the economies of representation and hear from the thought leaders of the debate themselves on how to proceed. And as I found, and I'll show this in a little bit more detail, the state announced its decision in 2022 to abandon non-white meta-categories after relying on networks of thought leaders who share with the government that the categories were now viewed as pejorative and inappropriate. So understanding that its categories must be accepted by the government, state bureaucrats were very attentive to and in fact welcomed being influenced by the debate. So again, as you can see, this model is quite unlike the state-centered models that predominate the literature, which assume that states create official categories and impose them. Instead, this is a clear example of civil society changes influencing how states modify categories. And I think that this was made possible, or at least I'm hypothesizing, due to a particular set of structural conditions for claims making spurred by the economies of representation. These debates then filtered back to influence the language used by the state. So let's go into findings. So first of all, it's no accident that a lot of these debates were happening around 2020, when the whole world was frozen due to a pandemic that was disproportionately killing communities of color, and when we witnessed the murder of George Floyd and finally entered a dialogue about the deadly effects of anti-Black racism. 2020 offered an opportunity structure, if you will, where people, and more specifically organizations, were listening. At the time, at a different time, metacategory critiques might have been dismissed as semantics, but 2020 basically offered an opportunity to broach the conversation about the categories and for them to be taken seriously. And in fact, not just taken seriously, some of them were adopted overnight without really understanding what they entailed. So for example, Candace in the US is basically saying, all of a sudden, she's in the nonprofit sphere, she's a consultant. All of a sudden, she has all these people coming up to her saying, we want to be BIPOC-led. And she said, well, what does that mean to you? I said, I don't know, you tell us. Well, if you don't know, why would you want to know? And then another kind of organizational leader from the UK basically says, before 2020, she had been thinking about this for a really long time. She hated BAME so much. It just wouldn't have been taken seriously. The understanding wouldn't have been there. So even with that, 2020 sort of being the sort of pivotal moment where organizations were listening, most respondents were basically kind of adopting different positions in the field, right? As I mentioned, there was a lot of different kind of orientations towards the categories. All of them, though, were invested in the categories as a way to capture their particular vision of the racial landscape and pathways to racial justice. Because implicit in the commentary was this understanding that the categories made certain groups, dynamics, and cleavages more visible than others. So for example, some of my older respondents who had witnessed the heyday of categories like political blackness or women of color felt a deep emotional attachment to them. And without them, they felt unmoored from a cross-racial we in the fight against white supremacy. So for example, my respondent Tiffany here from the US wrote an article about why she wished BIPOC would go away, and in fact cried because she really felt emotionally attached to the category and this kind of broader struggle that she wanted to be a part of. In contrast, David here admitted that he had been struggling with BAME for a long time. He felt they homogenized different experiences of oppression, overlooked anti-Blackness that was so prevalent in non-white communities, and assumed that minorities were natural allies, which frequently led to disappointment when real-life solidarity proved more complicated. They flattened the specifics that he thought were critical to highlight in order to achieve racial justice. So respondents critiquing the categories believe that the resolution of the debates was through disaggregation and specificity. The effort to name individual groups was seen as a sign of respect, an invitation to learn more about them, and ultimately a strategy to create more precise policymaking. So specificity encapsulated both a commitment to and an approach for understanding and addressing the unique needs of different groups through policies and procedures. Of course, and you can probably see this through some of the language that I've highlighted here, there were a lot of essentializing assumptions. Respondents in both the US and the UK told me, I think we should just say what we mean. Just say what you mean, as if there were more concrete, precise, or real units to describe people, and as if some of these subcategories weren't also doing a lot of homogenizing work. I think it's very interesting that a lot of them, while calling for greater specification, could not agree on the right level of specificity. Was it, in the example of Asian, right? Was it South Asian versus East Asian? Was it specific country of origin, Pakistani versus Bangladeshi versus Indian? Was it specific regions, Gujarati? Or was there even also maybe a focus on caste? Was there also maybe a wave of migration that we had to take into consideration and then add skin color to that? There were so many kind of fine-grained specifications that they were kind of getting lost in, that they really couldn't ultimately decide what was most important to kind of balance that precise policymaking, but also having a little bit of more power in the public sphere in terms of numbers. So meanwhile, a flurry of organizations adopted public stances about the category as a result of these debates. These organizations were predominantly in the nonprofit, academic, and DEI spaces. In addition to awareness of the debates in the public sphere, a lot of them were also hearing directly from their immediate audiences, clients, or partners about the categories, and they would go on to endorse basically across the board, more granular alternatives or reject the categories altogether, which they communicated in public statements that basically kind of underscore their commitment to increase specificity and recognition of difference. These public statements also added a degree of credibility and legitimacy to non-white meta-category critiques. For example, as when I mentioned that 5 different broadcasters, Channel 4, Channel 5, BBC, ITV, and I forget the last one, kind of all came together and said, we're not going to use BAME anymore, right? So those kinds of public statements really made it seem as if these debates were meaningful, these debates were important to pay attention to, and it's probably no surprise that a lot of organizations followed suit. Many organizations also noted that their decisions to intervene in the debates would enhance the public profile of the organization, their symbolic capital, either by gaining attention, cultivating trust with their audiences, or positioning their organization as on the cutting edge of terminology. As my respondent Shaheen says here on the bottom, they really wanted to take a lead on this in the sector. She was quite pleased because so many different organizations in the sector had followed suit when they updated their terminology guidelines. And in the US, there was also a lot of anxiety about using the right terminology. Again, in those sectors I mentioned, nonprofit, academia, DEI, organizations were really attuned to how diverse communities wanted to self-identify, even if that meant cycling through very rapidly changing terminology. As Kristen, my respondent here at the top, said, it was really about a principle of respect, which allowed them to demonstrate their commitment and closeness to the communities they served, and they wanted to make sure that they were able to protect that relationship at all costs. So amidst the calls for more specificity, what we start to see is a sort of alignment towards greater specificity, greater disaggregation happening across a lot of different institutional and professional spheres. So again, these respondents from organizations, nonprofits, and academia, they're all noticing this kind of broader shift towards greater particularity in terminology and data collection. And they see that not only in terms of the non-white meta-category debates, but kind of more practical applications as well. So they noted pressure requests for data disaggregation. So this is Catherine here at the top, who noticed that there was a lot more of a pushback on, okay, funding for people of color, but what does that mean specifically? Or requests to make more nuanced categories as well in the reports that they would do as kind of nonprofit consultants. They would also mention these kind of stylized facts. For example, Indians in the UK is succeeding in several indicators, while Bangladeshis in particular not doing well, as an impetus to change policies and procedures to form on disaggregated groups. So Ammo here, as a music industry leader, kind of talking about pushing away from these non-white meta-categories, getting more specific, and really using that to shape policy in the music industry. We're also seeing on both sides of the pond, as a result of this kind of move towards specificity and greater particularity, a focus on the singularity of Blackness due to the scope and scale of their oppression, as you can see kind of Daniel saying here at the bottom. For many, these categories of Black or Indigenous in the US as well were viewed as more concretely real compared to the manufactured non-white meta-categories. Some of them also noticed that this was a radical direction in racial justice ideologies and conversations by participants who wanted to be a part of the exploding Black Lives Matter movement, as Kathy, a racial justice organization leader, mentions at the top here. Like organizations, more broadly speaking, government bureaucrats spoke to a principle of respecting the right of diverse communities to determine how they wanted to be named and described. They said that accurately capturing how communities wanted to self-identify was a key principle in their work, which allowed them to ensure trust, precision, and thus accurate data collection, be more legible. This principle meant that they were very attuned to language. They didn't see these debates as just semantic distractions, and they were responsive to complaints that certain terms were viewed as pejorative, as was the case with BAME or minority. At the same time, and this is definitely some tea for later, and this is also all on the record, some civil servants in the UK felt that the emphasis on BAME terminology was purely a tactic to propel individual careers rather than any sort of meaningful change towards solving disparities. Finally, government bureaucrats in both countries mentioned a very consultative approach that they had adopted in recent years to community self-determination. They described in-depth research, teams dedicated to community engagement, and extensive networks of community leaders and researchers that help them understand the rapidly changing significance of categories and terminology. So they did mention, it's funny, some of us in this room might not have been aware of the BAME debates before I started speaking, but you better believe the state was. And they mentioned this awareness of the public debates because it would, again, kind of create hypotheses and questions that they would further explore through relationships with thought leaders. And they felt that the move towards greater granularity enabled them to have a much more compelling picture of society's diversity compared to the white, non-white, or majority-minority binary. I'm going to, because I'm starting to get closer to time, I'm going to kind of breeze through this difference in the fields. I think it's kind of interesting to note that there's, I'm looking generally at the sort of the context of similarity between the two, looking at these sort of transnational paradigms of specificity and these economies of representation that emerge in both contexts and connected them. But there's also clear differences in each local context based on the role of organizations, the use of data, and the understanding of the history of the terms, which created kind of different types of fields. So in the UK, it was a very cohesive field. People knew where the categories came from. They thought they were government imposed. We can kind of debate the veracity of that, but there was a common narrative at least, which allowed them to assume that the government was the bad guy and, basically was institutionalizing their non-belonging. Organizations were key thought leaders who basically called for research or organized formal research about the BAME categories, and it really created this clear-cut sense of what was wrong with BAME and the pathway forward, which was to get rid of BAME, which essentially resolved the debate shortly after. A lot of the respondents I talked to said, BAME, that's not really, we figured that out already, that's done. In contrast, in the in the US, there wasn't really a clear origin story to the categories. Some people knew that they came from like people of color. came from social movements, but a lot actually thought that they were imposed by white people or the media, which could really kind of influence how they thought about the categories, how warmly they were towards them. Individuals were more likely to be thought leaders in organizations. They were more likely to mobilize emotions, anecdotes, and personal experiences. And ultimately, this created less consensus about what to do about non-white metacategories and how to move forward, which is why BIPOC is still kind of floating around, sometimes not, sometimes people of color, sometimes not, sometimes nothing at all. And the other thing I should mention as well is that there's also this deeply almost kind of colonizing role of American influence on British terminology. Brits are trying to resist it, they're trying to reframe their context, but they acknowledge that the US, just because of its cultural dominance and its kind of position in global conversations about race and ethnicity was really influencing what was happening in the UK as well. So that really brings me to the end here. As you can see, there's this kind of flexibility of an unofficial category, an economy of representation that moves quickly and expediently to adapt non-white metacategories as opposed to other categories that would have been codified by the state census. They respond to broad pressures by enshrining modifications in organizational forms, names, networks, style guides. So these perennial battles for recognition, for visibility, for specificity that occur within any category have a quick win with this particular institutional configuration. The arc of the state moves slower, but it's also attuned to what is happening in the public and organizational sphere. It's tapping into people who are doing representational work. And ultimately, I think this is a very interesting and different model of change for racial and ethnic categories, showcasing how debates in the public sphere affect the state, but together create an alignment between fields that prioritizes greater specificity and disaggregation. So that's basically it. I have a ton of questions that I'm left with. What happens when the politics of representation becomes unbundled from the state? We get different end products, but does it also change the kinds of claims that can be made? Does it magnify a tendency towards disaggregation? And also, how might we think about 2020 versus today? At least in the US, the role of DEI is rapidly changing because of it's coming under attack. So we can imagine that a conversation like this really could have only happened in the years between 2020 and 2022. But I think that's worth maybe speculating a little bit about. I also have other questions for you guys that I would love to talk out loud, but I'm about at my time. So I'll stop and we can do a little Q&A.